This is the Nintendo Family Computer Disk System, an add-on for the Nintendo Family Computer, also known as the Famicom, the console that was redesigned and re-released in the West as the good old NES. And what does it do? Well, this thing, released in 1986, it lets you play games on discs like these instead of the standard console cartridges. And yes, I am now lucky enough to own one of these units after I was given one as a gift. As a wedding. What kind of weddings hand out obscure video gaming hardware? Awesome weddings, let me tell you. Though not my own, I should add, I was best man. But weddings are not what this video is about. Let's just start this thing up and we can see it in action. After being presented with a lovely animated boot BIOS screen, let's slide a disc in the drive and off we go. This won't take long. And that's it, the game is loaded miraculously quickly and seamlessly compared to a lot of other 8-bit disk systems. Anyone who's ever experienced one of these will definitely agree. This is clearly a well-engineered device. It was never released outside of Japan, but that's not for any technical reasons. It actually will work as is with the front-loading Western NES with some modding or with a hard-to-find adapter. It's compatible, it just doesn't fit, though it is easier with the top-loading new-style NES. It probably wouldn't have been a huge problem for Nintendo to make an actual NES version of this that worked out of the box if they wanted to, but they never did. Though I'm not going to talk too much about the history of this device or Nintendo in the 80s, other people have done that before better than I could hope to. I do though want to take a dive into the technical aspects of this fascinating machine and explain how it expanded the possibilities of the Famicom and the NES, even outside of Japan. Yeah, this thing had a big impact even in places that it wasn't released, and most of the very best disc games are ones you'll probably already have heard of, even if you've never laid eyes on this thing before today, mainly because so many of them were re-released in the West on cartridges. In fact, the Famicom Disk System was the original home of some of the very biggest and most loaded games from the NES catalogue. This is Gunsmoke from Capcom, one of a few developers who gave the Disk System a go, but there are plenty of others. But how does this thing actually work? Well, let's take a look at the main disk drive unit. It's quite chunky, but it does have a battery compartment hidden in there. That might seem like a very odd idea, but you saw how quickly games can load. I don't know, but I'm willing to bet batteries would last quite a while in this thing. I just run it off an adapter, but using batteries would mean one less cable and one less plug socket taken up, may be quite handy if you live in a cramped apartment. And the discs, or disc cards as Nintendo called them, well, they're a proprietary Nintendo-only format, but they are based on the Mitsumi Quick Disc, one of the many types of discs from the 80s that never really went anywhere. They hold 64 kilobytes per side, 128k in total, which might not sound like much, but in 1986 it wasn't bad and was quite a bit more than the 40 kilobytes that Nintendo's cartridges at the time were limited to. There's another part of this though, what they call the RAM adapter. Yeah, this is how it connects to the console through the cartridge port. In here is, well, quite a lot of circuitry, but mainly RAM, 40 kilobytes to be precise, yes, the exact same as an original cartridge, which makes sense because Nintendo designed this to load existing games from disk. And the majority of cartridges that were already around when this came out would have been relatively easy to convert to disc format, and many were. Loads of Nintendo's own titles, tennis, golf, Wrecking Crew, Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers, and games from other publishers like The Goonies from Konami and Galaga from Namco. It's sort of like an old school flash cart. You could load many different games into the rewritable memory from a disc rather than having to rely on expensive ROM chips in cartridges. Cheaper to make, cheaper to buy, everybody wins, especially Nintendo. Yes, you had to buy the disk system itself, but once you had that, cheaper games could be yours, and they could be quite cheap. Kiosks set up in stores could write you a new game onto a disc for 500 yen. Even in the 80s, that was not a lot of money. But the disk system didn't just give Nintendo gamers what they already had in a cheaper format. It also expanded the Famicom's capabilities. I'm sure you'll recognise this as Castlevania, or to give it its Japanese title, Akumajo Dracula. Yes, this started out live on the Famicom Disk System. Released in September 1986, almost a year to the day after Super Mario Bros., and really quite a leap ahead in presentation. The beginning of a really well-loved series, a tiny 8-bit epic inspired by Western horror tropes with loads of style. It takes up both sides of a Famicom disc, so it is a whole 128 kilobytes or something close to it, more than 3 times what standard cartridges could offer. But there is a bit more to the story than that though, because the data in original NES carts was split up in a weird way. In a 40 kilobyte cartridge you had up to 32 kilobytes of program data and just 8 kilobytes of graphics data, which was stored separately in its own ROM chips. With the Famicom Disk System you've got that, but in the form of RAM, so you can load lots more game code and lots more graphics in as you need them. You can keep refilling the memory from disk as the player goes through the game. This means you can do more, have more varied stages, more backgrounds, more enemies, unique bosses, weapons, death animations, all that kind of stuff. Super Mario Bros. Constantly recycled its graphics to stretch out what was there in its 8 kilobyte character ROM as it was called, but Castlevania, well, I don't know how much graphics data this game uses, but it's more than 8 kilobytes. It does recycle some graphical elements, but it really is a lot less repetitive visually than those early Famicom cartridge games were. But this game, amazing and enduring as it is, maybe it doesn't really give the disk system a thorough workout, not as much as some other games did. This was the first game that Konami made for the Famicom Disk System, and I do get the impression that this is something they were already working on and they decided to turn it into a disc game to try the system out, rather than something that was tailor-made to make use of the disk system's special talents from the very start. If we want to see a game that really does that, well, we're going to have to wind back a bit and take a look at one of the launch titles. And this really was the birth of something very big. It's The Legend of Zelda. The Hyrule Fantasy Zelda no Densetsu, to give it its Japanese title, and it was launched in February 1986 alongside 6 others. Whilst the rest were games already available on cartridge, this was the first and for a while the only dedicated disk system game, but it really went in hard. A showcase for what disc games could bring to the Famicom, starting with the music. Yes, the disk system didn't just add extra storage, but extra sound too. One wavetable based sound channel, which wasn't a huge addition, but did give a slightly richer sound palette, meaning that this and more than a few other disk system games have, well, maybe nicer soundtracks, so that does seem to be a matter of opinion, but I've got to say I do prefer it. This is a feature that the NES was never able to match, by the way, even if you do plug in a disk system, because for some reason the NES doesn't have the sound input pin on the cartridge connector that this requires to mix the new sounds in. Instead it was moved to the expansion socket underneath, though there is a mod you can do to restore this functionality. Of course, there's lots of other things going on here too in this fantastic game, and it's not just about extra storage space. The fact that the disk system has lots more RAM increases what you can do with a game. You don't just have to use this RAM like a rewritable cartridge. Instead of just filling it with program data, you can use it as extra work RAM. The base NES or Famicom has just 2 kilobytes of RAM built in, and you absolutely do need at least a little bit of RAM even if your game is stored on a cartridge, because you need to be able to keep track of your game's state. The score, the time, what level the player is on, what weapons they have, all that sort of stuff. The extra RAM of the disk system means your game can have a more complex state, and that's certainly true of Zelda. There are so many items that Link can have, so many different quantities of stuff you can use, but also so many things the player can do in this very early example of an open world. The disk system has enough working memory to be able to handle all this stuff, all the possibilities of this non-linear adventure. And yes, you can save your position too. Disks are rewritable, so this state can be saved and you can go back to your game later. One of the essential features of The Legend of Zelda that was there from the beginning. So, an era-defining masterpiece, but that's not going to be news to anyone. The beginning of probably the most critically acclaimed game series of them all, but actually by no means on its own as a huge hit from the disc era. Zelda was one of 5 really big Nintendo first-party games, defining games of the NES that got their start with this add-on, all within the first 18 months of its life. There's also Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Once again, nice use of the hardware, though maybe not everyone's favourite Zelda game. There's also the mighty Metroid 2, different from Zelda, but well, also such a pioneer in blending action, adventure and RPG-like elements, but you probably already know that, don't you? And there's also Kid Icarus, again a sort of pioneering game and again the beginning of a series, but one that never quite got going in the same way that Metroid and Zelda did. But the last of this 5 to come out, not the beginning of, but part of Nintendo's absolute biggest franchise, though under a different name, it's Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic. And yes, the name won't be so familiar to Western NES fans, but the underlying game itself will be. Quite a famous story now. Nintendo ditched their original Super Mario Bros. Sequel, also a Famicom Disk game, after Nintendo of America decided it was too hard and too samey. Instead, this game, which was originally based on some sort of Fuji TV tie-in, was rebranded as the new Super Mario Bros. 2. Not all that much changed in the transition apart from the graphics, the story of course, and a few minor gameplay tweaks. On the Disk System original, there is once again some very heavy use of the extra RAM. This helps in giving the game large and complex areas that you can move around freely in. Not the full story on that, but it does play a big part in it. As well, this also makes use of the video RAM too in a more sophisticated way. There's 4 different characters in this game and you can choose any one in any level. Having video RAM instead of a fixed ROM lets the game load in just the character the player has selected alongside all the other graphics needed for the level. But this game also makes use of compression so that its graphics take up less space on the disc. This uses 2 sides of a disc, but there's actually more than 128k of data in this game because it uses packing routines to cram more graphics in there and then unpack them into the video RAM when they need to be used, a sneaky way of maximising storage potential that relies on RAM. But at this point you might well be saying, this is fine, but whatever the Famicom Disk System did, it can't have been that unique. All of these games were released on cartridges in the West within a year or 2 of their original release on disc. Its special features must have been pretty easy to translate to cartridge, surely. Well, no, that belies the weird truth of it, because Nintendo had to do a lot of work to make these games into cartridges for the standard NES, requiring heavy use of so-called enhancement chips, stuff built into the cartridges themselves that could give the NES extra powers. A sort of hardware add-on included with the game itself. They built the features of the disk system, or a simplified version of it, into the cartridges. Now, it's important to note that whilst Nintendo had been having fun with discs, other companies making Famicom games in Japan hadn't been slacking. They had been coming up with their own NES or Famicom enhancements, and in fact it was these third-party games developers who seemed to have come up with the whole idea in the first place. Jaleco was the first out of the gate with the home conversion of their game City Connection. This featured a whole 16 kilobytes of graphics data, twice the usual amount, plus the extra circuitry to make use of it. And it wasn't long before others joined in, and by mid-1986 there were already many games that were as large as what could be offered on disc but on a cartridge. But there were still things that the disk system could do that cartridges couldn't at this point, so when Nintendo wanted to make cartridge versions of games like Zelda for international release, they needed to go a few steps further. In fact, Zelda, Metroid and Kid Icarus all featured cartridges that had an extra 16 kilobytes of RAM built in, 8 kilobytes of work RAM and 8 kilobytes of video RAM. Not as much as what the disk system had built in, but enough to make these games work with their heavy RAM requirements. Kid Icarus and Metroid had their disk saving abilities replaced with passwords. Annoying, but that just about did the job. Zelda though, well, there was just way too much happening. The passwords would have been huge. Instead it uses a battery backed up save system where a small battery provides just enough power to keep data stored in the cartridge's RAM chip over a long period of time. When it came to turn Doki Doki Panic into Super Mario Bros. 2 in 1988, it would have made sense if Nintendo had done it the same way as they did with these previous games with 16 kilobytes of RAM, but actually they did something different. By this point, Nintendo had a new type of enhancement chip, which is a stupid name. Mappers are what they're really called, and Nintendo debuted the MMC3 mapper for Super Mario Bros. 2, which could not only recreate most of what the disk system could do, but could also go even further. This cartridge still had 8 kilobytes of work RAM built in. They needed that for the level buffer, but it didn't have the 8 kilobytes of video RAM. It used other methods to do the same things. Remember how I said Doki Doki Panic used the video RAM to mix and match different graphical elements? Well, the MMC3 mapper can do that with ROM. It can split up a large graphics ROM file into chunks and swap them in and out as needed really easily. But what about the compression? Doesn't that need video RAM to work? Well, it does, and Nintendo just didn't compress the graphics. Doki Doki Panic fit onto a single 128K disc card, but it had a 256 kilobyte cartridge when it came out as Super Mario Bros. 2. Admittedly, they did add in a bit extra in the form of, spoiler alert, this ending animation, but that doesn't account for all the extra space needed. I really don't know why they did it this way. The cost of chips was a huge reason that Nintendo went with the disk system in the first place. There was a major shortage of them worldwide. Things had not got better by 1988, in fact apparently it was getting worse, but maybe RAM was harder to source at this time and ROM chips were cheaper. In the end, the disk system wasn't a huge failure, but neither was it a massive success. The last game came out for it in 1992, but Nintendo had sidelined it much sooner than that, and other major developers weren't any keener to make games for it. It did though somehow seem to spur everyone on. Would Nintendo have made Zelda when they did if it wasn't going to be a disc game? If right from the start they'd have needed to add RAM and battery saving to the cart, would they have made it? Especially in a semiconductor shortage like the world was going through at the time. Maybe not, maybe they would have gone for something less technically groundbreaking, something less sophisticated, and if they didn't make Zelda, well, they probably wouldn't have made Metroid or any of the others, and would the company have done so well? Would the NES have been so big in the USA, its first foreign territory, without those huge killer games? And what about the rest of the industry? Nintendo and their games were very, very influential. They were the company to beat. Things might have been different. How many games over the years have borrowed from Zelda and Metroid? And Super Mario Bros. 3, Nintendo's non-disc-based worldwide success, might have been different without the disc system too, even though it didn't come out for it. If Super Mario Bros. 3 was at any point in its development going to be a disc game, they must have dropped it fairly early on, because it does things you can't easily do with the disc system's video RAM arrangement. But it does have an 8 kilobyte RAM chip in there, and it uses it to allow for the very complex stages that the game has. I don't know, but I do wonder if the experience Nintendo had in making their disc games work as cartridges led them to being able to create something that pushes the NES as hard as Super Mario Bros. 3 does. It came out in Japan only a month after Super Mario Bros. 2 came out in the USA, so they must have been worked on simultaneously, and it also uses that same MMC3 mapper. The Famicom Disk System had other more obscure capabilities like an interrupt request controller and the ability to switch what's called mirroring on the fly. Pretty dry technical stuff, but whatever. By the end of the 80s, cartridges could recreate it all and do way more besides, extending the NES's capabilities and its commercial life quite significantly. So the disc thing itself wasn't a big success, but weirdly the games that came out for it were cornerstones of classic gaming for many fans, and it helped make Nintendo what they still are, a massive company at the forefront of game design. But it wasn't only Nintendo that benefited from this odd situation. Final Fantasy was originally going to be a disc game as well, but that was ditched and it became another cart with a load of extra RAM in it. Would it have ever happened if they'd not started out targeting the Famicom Disk? It also might well have inspired NEC2 to make the PC Engine / TurboGrafx CD, the first CD-ROM based gaming system, another industry breakthrough. There's a lot of unanswered questions surrounding this add-on. Why did Nintendo seem to lose faith in it so quickly? Was it just piracy? Those discs were very easy to copy, but it seems to occupy a weird place in Nintendo's history. Cartridges did soon start to offer more possibilities, but I can't think they were ever so cheap to manufacture. I just don't know. So I'm gonna leave this here for now. I don't want to get lost in any more spurious historical speculation, but thank you so much as ever to my generous patrons. I really do appreciate your help, and if anyone else out there would like to join them, there is a link below. That would be amazing. So let's say game over for now. Thank you for watching this much of this video. Thank you for getting to the end, and I'll see you next time.